If you're ready, let me tell you a story, one that begins on an ordinary afternoon and tumbles quite quickly into the most extraordinary of worlds. Her name was Alice, and on that particular day, she was sitting beside her sister under a tree, trying very hard not to yawn. The air was warm, the sky was clear, and her sister was reading a book with no pictures and no conversations in it at all. What is the use of a book? Alice thought, watching a little cloud drift lazily overhead, without pictures or talking. Her mind wandered in that sleepy, drifting way minds do on slow afternoons, and her eyes followed a line of ants marching along the grass. She might have drifted off completely had something most unexpected not happened. Across the field, hurrying along as if extremely late, came a white rabbit. Now, a rabbit in itself is nothing strange, but this one wore a little waistcoat. It had a pocket watch, and as it ran, it muttered to itself, oh dear, I shall be too late." Alice sat bolt upright. That was certainly not something she saw every day. Before she had any time to think about how rabbits obtained waistcoats, or watches, or pressing appointments, curiosity leaped ahead of reason. She got up and ran after it. The rabbit scurried across the field and disappeared into a large rabbit hole under the hedge. Alice reached the opening and, without much thought, for she tended to act first and wonder afterward, she went after it. Down, down, down. At first she expected a short tunnel, but this was no ordinary burrow. She found herself falling, slowly at first, as if the air itself was made of invisible cushions. Shelves slid past her with jars labeled orange marmalade and little books drifting by like feathers. She managed to grab one jar, only to find it empty, and politely put it back on another shelf as she continued to fall. "This is a very long way down," she thought. She began to imagine she might fall through the center of the earth and come out among people who walked with their feet upward. Just as she was deciding whether she ought to curtsy when she met them, the fall came to an end with a soft thump on a pile of dry leaves. She sat up, more surprised than hurt, and found herself in a long corridor. There was the white rabbit, still in a dreadful hurry, vanishing around a corner. "Wait!" she called, scrambling to her feet and chasing after him. But she turned the corner just in time to see him dart through a little door and disappear. Alice stopped. Here stood a small table, and on it, a tiny golden key. Along the wall were several doors of different shapes and sizes, but they were all locked. At last she found a little door behind a curtain. She tried the key, and the lock turned easily. When she pushed the door open, she gasped. On the other side lay a beautiful garden, bathed in soft light, with bright flowers and fountains splashing cheerfully. It was the loveliest place she had ever seen. But the door was far too small for her to walk through. She could barely fit her head in. Close by on the table, however, she noticed a small bottle, with a label tied neatly around its neck. The label simply said, "Drink me." Alice looked at it suspiciously. "It is very well to say, 'Drink me,' but I should like to know if it is safe." Still, it didn't smell of poison. It smelled interesting, like a mixture of cherry tart, custard, and warm toast. After a few cautious sips, she began to feel herself growing smaller, smaller and smaller, until the table towered above her like a monument. At last, she was exactly the right size to pass through the door. "Now I shall see the garden," she said happily. But when she reached the door, she realized she had made a very simple, very unfortunate mistake. She had left the key on the table, far out of reach. There it lay, glittering mockingly overhead, and no amount of jumping would help her reach it. Tears came into her eyes, but she blinked them away. Crying never helped anyone reach a key, after all. Just then, she noticed a little glass box beneath the table. Inside was a small cake with the words, "Eat me," spelled out in candied fruit. If this makes me larger, Alice decided, I may yet reach the key. And if it makes me smaller, well, that would be quite impossible, as I am already so very small. With no better plan at hand, she took a bite. This time she grew, and how she grew! The walls slid down, the ceiling rose up, and the table shrank beneath her until she loomed over it like a giant. Her arms stretched, her feet pushed against the floor. She was now much too large for the little door, but at least she could pick up the key. The trouble was, she could hardly move at all. The room suddenly felt terribly tight, and the thought of ever fitting into the lovely garden seemed more impossible than ever. Frustrated and overwhelmed, Alice began to cry in earnest, and her tears, now quite enormous, gathered into a great pool at her feet. She cried until she realized she was standing ankle-deep in water. "This will never do," she told herself, and scrubbed her eyes dry. Fortunately, the strange world did not remain the same size for long. With another change of size, another taste of this, another sip of that, the room and Alice wasted no time becoming completely unreasonable. At last, after much confusion and many sudden changes in height, which would have been very alarming had she not been rather quick at adapting by now, she found herself small again, swept along in the pool of tears she had cried when she was much larger. In the water swam a most peculiar company: a mouse, a duck, a dodo, and several other creatures, all looking rather uncomfortable, but trying to stay dignified despite the circumstances. They all scrambled onto a bank, and after a somewhat chaotic discussion about who was driest and what was the best way to become dry, a kind of race was proposed. It was no ordinary race, of course. Everyone ran in circles in whichever direction they pleased, until the dodo decided it had gone on long enough and declared everyone a winner. This pleased the company greatly, especially when small prizes were produced, most of which had originally been in Alice's pocket. She found the whole thing bewildering, but there was hardly time to think about it because the white rabbit suddenly appeared again, fussing and fidgeting. "Oh, my ears and whiskers, how late it is!" When she saw Alice, he mistook her for a servant and ordered her to fetch his gloves and fan from his house. Before she could object, he hurried off again, leaving her with very little choice in the matter. Curious and slightly amused, she followed the directions he had shouted and soon came to a neat little house labeled with his name. Inside, she found the gloves and fan, but also something else: bottles, cakes, and things that looked suspiciously like the odd items that had already caused her so much trouble. Naturally, she tasted one, and naturally, everything went absurd again. In a blink, she found herself growing so fast that her arms stretched out the windows and her feet pressed against the door. The house creaked as if it would burst. Outside, she heard tiny voices arguing about what monstrous creature had gotten into the rabbit's home. Pebbles were thrown at the windows, which, to Alice's surprise, turned to little cakes as they fell on the floor. Thinking quickly, she ate one and began shrinking once more until she was small enough to run out the door and slip away into the surrounding grass. The world was enormous again. Every blade of grass rose like a tree. As she walked, wondering what else could possibly happen, she met a blue caterpillar perched upon a mushroom, smoking a long hookah as calmly as this were the most ordinary of afternoons. The caterpillar regarded Alice with heavy-lidded eyes and asked her, in a lazy voice, who she was. It was a very simple question, but by this point, Alice was no longer sure of the answer. She had been so many different sizes in such a short time that she felt not entirely herself. After much puzzling conversation and a few sharp remarks from the caterpillar, he finally offered a hint before he slid away into the forest, that one side of the mushroom would make her grow taller and the other side would make her grow smaller. This was the most practical information she had received so far. Breaking off a piece from each side, she began to experiment, nibbling first one, then the other, growing and shrinking in sudden jolts like a badly tuned instrument. At last, she managed a sensible height, though perhaps a touch taller than usual, and continued on her way, pockets full of mushroom pieces just in case. It wasn't long before she came upon a house with a chimney shaped like a fish's tail and a roof that seemed to tilt slightly whenever she looked at it. Outside, a table was laid under a tree, where a hatter with wild hair, a March hare with very alert ears, and a dormouse trying hard to sleep sat at a perpetual tea party. Cups were scattered everywhere, spoons and sugar bowls, crumbs on everything. There were many